November 13th, 2016. Pakistani and Chinese officials break ground on a port expansion project in Gwadar, a fishing village on the Arabian Sea. The ceremony includes military bands, diplomatic speeches, and promises of economic development that will transform Pakistan's poorest province into a commercial hub. Western media coverage is minimal, treating it as another infrastructure project in the endless stream of Chinese overseas investment and development lending to poor nations. But at the Pentagon, analysts are studying maps with the same intensity that British strategists studied the Berlin-Baghdad railway route in 1899. Because Gwadar Port is not just a commercial facility designed to handle container ships and facilitate regional trade through modern transportation infrastructure, it is the western anchor of the Belt and Road Initiative, China's trillion-dollar plan to reconstruct the ancient Silk Road through modern infrastructure. And if you understand how the Berlin-Baghdad Railway threatened British naval supremacy a century ago, you understand why Gwadar represents an existential threat today. Recall the pattern we established in the Libya analysis. Any challenge to the architecture of Western hegemony is met with overwhelming force. In 1899, Germany proposed a railway that would bypass British-controlled sea lanes, accessing Mesopotamian resources without British naval interference or permission. Britain responded by encircling Germany with alliances, culminating in World War I, which killed 20 million people to preserve British control of trade routes. The railway was never completed, and the Ottoman territories were divided among victorious powers, ensuring British access to Middle Eastern oil for decades afterward. In 2011, Libya proposed a gold-backed currency that would bypass the dollar system, allowing African nations to trade resources without US monetary control. NATO responded with regime change. Flying 26. 500 sorties to destroy Gaddafi's government before the gold dinar could move from blueprint to implementation. The pattern is identical across time. Threaten the mechanism of hegemony, and the hegemon destroys you before the threat becomes operationally viable. But China's Belt and Road Initiative is not Libya, and this is where the analysis becomes more complex and the potential consequences more catastrophic. Because China is not a middle power with 6 million people that can be isolated and destroyed through a 7-month bombing campaign. China is a nuclear-armed state with 4 billion people, the world's largest manufacturing base, and increasingly sophisticated military capabilities, including hypersonic missiles and carrier-killer weapons. So the United States cannot simply bomb Gwadar Port and expect China to accept this the way Gaddafi's scattered military accepted NATO's intervention. Instead, the US must employ a more sophisticated strategy, encircle China with alliances, arm its neighbors, and create crises that justify intervention without direct confrontation. And if this sounds familiar, it is because this is precisely the strategy Britain employed against Germany from 1904 to 1914 with the Entente Cordiale. Let us be precise about what the Belt and Road Initiative actually is, because Western media coverage often treats it as vague infrastructure lending. The BRI is a network of railways, highways, ports, and pipelines connecting China to Europe through Central Asia. Bypassing maritime routes the US Navy controls, the land routes move through Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Iran, and Turkey, creating a direct connection from Shanghai to Rotterdam that avoids the Strait of Malacca entirely. The maritime routes supplement land connections with port facilities in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Greece, creating alternatives to traditional shipping lanes through chokepoints. And critically, the entire system is financed through Chinese loans, built by Chinese companies, and secured by Chinese military presence disguised as security cooperation. This is not infrastructure investment for altruistic purposes or some generous development program to help poor nations build their economies without strings attached. This is geopolitical strategy disguised as economic cooperation, creating dependencies that translate into political influence and military access when crises emerge or conflicts develop. The mechanism is straightforward and has been employed by great powers throughout history, from Roman roads to British railways across colonial Africa. China loans money to Pakistan to build Gwadar Port, with interest rates below market and repayment timelines extending 30 years into the future. Pakistan cannot repay the loans because its economy is not productive enough to generate the surplus needed to service debt of this magnitude. China forgives the debt in exchange for a 40-year lease on the port, giving Chinese companies operational control over a strategic maritime facility. Chinese military vessels begin using the port for refueling and resupply, claiming this is purely for anti-piracy operations and freedom of navigation exercises. And suddenly, China has a naval presence in the Arabian Sea, 400 kilometers from the Strait of Hormuz, where 21% of global petroleum passes daily. This pattern has repeated across the Belt and Road network, from Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka to Piraeus Port in Greece to Djibouti's military base. And each facility represents another node in what U.S. strategists call the String of Pearls, a network of Chinese-controlled ports encircling the Indian Ocean. The String of Pearls concept was first articulated in a 2005 report by consulting firm Booz Allen Hamilton, commissioned by the U.S. Department of Defense. The report identified Chinese port investments from Myanmar to Pakistan to East Africa as part of a deliberate strategy to secure sea lanes. But more critically, the report warned that these ports could be converted to military facilities during crises, giving China the ability to project power. And if China can project naval power into the Indian Ocean, the entire architecture of American maritime dominance collapses like the British Empire after Suez. Because American hegemony since 1945 has rested on a simple geographic fact, the U.S. Navy controls every maritime choke point that matters for global trade. The Strait of Hormuz, where Persian Gulf oil enters global markets. The Strait of Malacca, where Asian trade flows to Europe and Africa. The Suez Canal, connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. The Panama Canal, connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, controlling Red Sea access. Control these choke points, and you control global trade. Which means you control which nations prosper and which nations starve during conflicts or economic crises. This is not theoretical dominance or abstract strategic advantage, but concrete military capability that has been demonstrated repeatedly throughout the post-war era. In 1953, the U.S. Navy blockaded Guatemala during the CIA-backed coup, preventing any external support from reaching the Arbenz government and ensuring regime change. In 1962, the U.S. Navy enforced a quarantine of Cuba during the missile crisis, stopping Soviet ships and forcing Khrushchev to back down. In 1990, the U.S. Navy blockaded Iraq after the invasion of Kuwait, preventing 90% of Iraqi trade and starving the economy before Desert Storm began. In 2010, the U.S. Navy enforced sanctions on Iran by monitoring the Strait of Hormuz, boarding ships, and preventing oil exports that would fund nuclear programs. This capability depends entirely on geography. The U.S. Navy can station carrier groups near choke points and intercept any vessel, because alternatives do not exist. But if China builds land routes that bypass maritime choke points entirely, the U.S. Navy becomes strategically irrelevant to the most important trade flows. The train from Shanghai to Rotterdam through Kazakhstan and Russia does not pass through the Strait of Malacca, so the U.S. cannot intercept it. A pipeline from Gwadar to Xinjiang delivering Middle Eastern oil does not cross oceans, so the U.S. Navy cannot blockade it during a crisis. And if China can access resources and markets without depending on sea lanes, American naval supremacy stops translating into geopolitical leverage and economic influence. This is the nightmare scenario that keeps Pentagon strategists awake at night. The reason Gwadar Port receives more analytical attention than its size suggests. Because Gwadar is not just a port on Pakistan's coast, but the western terminus of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a $62 billion infrastructure network. The economic corridor includes highways from Gwadar to the Chinese border, railways connecting to the Xinjiang region, and pipelines to transport energy directly to China. And once operational, this corridor allows China to import Middle Eastern oil without ships passing through the Strait of Malacca that the U.S. Navy monitors constantly. The Strait of Malacca is a choke point 800 kilometers long and as narrow as 8 kilometers at its tightest point between Indonesia and Malaysia. Approximately 25% of global oil trade passes through this strait daily, along with 60% of Chinese energy imports needed to fuel factories and power cities. If the U.S. Navy blockaded the Strait of Malacca during a crisis over Taiwan, China's economy would collapse within weeks as energy supplies evaporate. But if the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is operational, that same blockade becomes strategically meaningless because oil flows overland through protected pipelines and railways. And without the ability to threaten China's energy supply, the U.S. loses its primary leverage in any confrontation over Taiwan. South China Sea disputes. This is why the United States has responded to Belt and Road with a strategy that mirrors British encirclement of Germany before World War I. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, known as the Quad, brings together the United States, Japan, India, and Australia to contain Chinese expansion through military cooperation. The AUKUS agreement provides Australia with nuclear-powered submarines specifically designed to operate in waters near Chinese ports and shipping lanes throughout the Indo-Pacific. increased military aid to Taiwan, including $19 billion in weapons sales since 2017, designed to make any invasion prohibitively costly for Beijing. The Chip and Science Act restricts Chinese access to advanced semiconductors, attempting to slow military modernization and technological advancement that threatens U.S. superiority. And critically, increased U.S. military presence in the Philippines, Pakistan's neighbor, with new bases accessing strategic locations near South China Sea shipping lanes. Each of these moves is justified as defensive, protecting freedom of navigation and supporting democratic allies against authoritarian aggression from an expansionist power. But the pattern is offensive encirclement, creating a network of alliances and military positions that surround China and threaten its access to resources. And China recognizes this pattern because Chinese strategists study history, particularly the encirclement of Germany that led to World War I, despite no one wanting it. So China has responded by accelerating Belt and Road construction, racing to complete land routes before the encirclement becomes militarily enforceable through blockades or intervention. Gwadar Port reached operational capacity in 2018, with the first container ships arriving and Chinese companies managing operations under the 40-year lease agreement. The Karakoram Highway connecting Gwadar to Xinjiang is being upgraded to handle increased truck traffic, with tunnels and bridges allowing year-round transportation through mountain terrain. Railway construction is proceeding despite challenging terrain, with Chinese engineers employing techniques developed for the Tibet Railway to cross the Himalayas and reach Pakistani ports. And Chinese military presence in Pakistan is increasing through security cooperation agreements, joint exercises, and weapons sales that include submarines and fighter aircraft to Islamabad. The question is not whether the United States will oppose this, because opposition is already evident through the Quad and AUKUS and restrictions on technology. The question is whether opposition escalates to military confrontation, and whether that confrontation can be contained or spirals into global war no one intended, because here is where the Berlin-Baghdad comparison becomes most disturbing, revealing patterns that suggest we are sleepwalking toward catastrophe. Despite knowing the historical precedent, nobody in 1914 wanted World War I. Not the Kaiser, not the Tsar, not even the British politicians who had constructed the alliance system. The war happened because the alliance system created automatic escalation, where a regional crisis in the Balkans triggered continent-wide mobilization within days of the assassination. Once Russia mobilized to support Serbia, Germany mobilized to support Austria, France mobilized to support Russia, and Britain mobilized to support France through treaty obligations. And within 6 weeks, 70 million men were under arms, fighting a war that nobody planned, nobody wanted, and nobody could stop once started. The current situation contains similar escalation dynamics, where a crisis over Taiwan or the South China Sea could trigger automatic responses from alliance systems. If China moves against Taiwan, the United States is committed to defend the island through the Taiwan Relations Act and decades of strategic ambiguity. If the U.S. intervenes, Japan is obligated to support American forces operating from bases on Japanese territory through the Mutual Defense Treaty signed in 1960. If Japan enters the conflict, South Korea faces pressure to support its ally, despite having no direct interest in Taiwan's political status or independence. And suddenly, a regional dispute over an island has become a global conflict involving the world's 3 largest economies and 2 nuclear-armed great powers. The difference is that World War I involved rifles, artillery, and poison gas, while World War III would involve nuclear weapons and hypersonic missiles. The difference is that World War I killed 20 million people over 4 years, while World War III could kill 200 million in the first 4 weeks. And the cause would be the same, a great power challenger attempting to bypass the hegemon's geographic advantages through infrastructure that makes naval control irrelevant. Germany built a railway to bypass British sea lanes, and Britain destroyed Germany to preserve its maritime empire, despite the cost in lives and treasure. China is building ports and pipelines to bypass American naval dominance. And the question is whether America will accept decline or fight to preserve hegemony, because that is the choice. And there is no middle ground where both powers maintain their current positions without collision or compromise that neither seems willing. The United States cannot remain the global hegemon if China controls Eurasian land routes, because hegemony requires controlling trade flows and economic dependencies that create leverage. China cannot achieve its development goals if the US Navy can blockade its energy supplies, because development requires reliable access to resources without foreign interference. One power must yield, or Both powers must find a new architecture that accommodates Chinese land power and American naval power without conflict. But history suggests that rising powers and declining hegemons do not accommodate each other peacefully. They fight wars that devastate continents and kill millions unnecessarily. Thucydides wrote too, 400 years ago, that it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. The Thucydides Trap suggests that when a rising power threatens to displace an established hegemon, war is the most likely outcome in 75% of cases. And we are currently watching this trap close around both nations, with infrastructure investments and military alliances creating the conditions for automatic escalation from any crisis. So, is the United States forcing a war to stop China's New Silk Road? Or is this simply great power competition that happens to look like encirclement? The answer depends on whether you believe American policymakers have learned anything from the Berlin-Baghdad precedent, or whether they are repeating it with more destructive weapons. The evidence suggests they have not learned, because the strategy is identical: encircle the challenger, arm its neighbors, create crises that justify intervention without direct confrontation. And if history repeats, we will wake up one morning to discover that a minor incident in the South China Sea has triggered a war nobody wanted. A collision between ships, an accidental shooting, a miscalculation during an exercise. And suddenly carrier groups are engaging submarines while missiles target ports and bases, and historians will write about how inevitable it all was, how the structural forces made conflict unavoidable, how leaders were trapped by circumstances beyond their control. But the truth will be simpler and more damning. We had the historical precedent. We understood the dynamics. And we chose hegemony over peace anyway, because that is what hegemons do when faced with decline. They fight rather than adapt. They choose war rather than accept a multipolar world. And Gwadar Port, that fishing village on Pakistan's coast, will be remembered as the Sarajevo of the 21st century, the place where it all began. Not because Gwadar mattered strategically more than any other port, but because it represented the moment when bypass became possible and the hegemon had to choose: accept Chinese land routes and lose the ability to control global trade through naval dominance, or oppose them and risk nuclear war to preserve maritime hegemony. The United States chose opposition, and whether that choice leads to war depends on how aggressively that opposition is pursued and whether China backs down. But nothing in China's history suggests they will back down. And nothing in American history suggests they will accept decline without fighting to preserve dominance. So yes, the US is forcing a confrontation to stop China's New Silk Road, just as Britain forced confrontation to stop Germany's Berlin-Baghdad railway a century ago. And the only question remaining is whether this confrontation can be managed through diplomacy, or whether it escalates into the war that ends civilization as we know it. Because that is what is at stake when hegemons fight over infrastructure. Not just ports and railways, but the entire international order and who controls it. And Gwadar Port is where that fight becomes visible, where the abstract theories of geopolitics become concrete threats that demand military responses from insecure superpowers facing decline. This is not speculation about hypothetical futures, but pattern recognition based on how the world actually works. When great powers collide over control of trade routes, the Berlin-Baghdad Railway ended in World War. And the Belt and Road Initiative is following the exact same trajectory, unless something changes dramatically in how powers manage competition. And so far, nothing has changed, except the weapons have become more destructive and the consequences more catastrophic if the pattern repeats itself one final time. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.